Well, we're here in your studio, Mark, and thank you for inviting us. We're sharing it with some other people. I think there's some students recently graduated who are celebrating just next door, and talking about art as we are. So there'll be some atmospheric noise that's part of the kind of buzz of the place. As you know, part of the reason we're having this conversation is to do with a project I run at King's College London called the Visual Commentary on Scripture, and that's why we're interested in the way that Scripture or biblical texts have an influence on creative work of artists and filmmakers and writers. There are particular texts that have played a role in your work. Ecclesiastes is one of them. You use Psalm 51 in a musical setting in Thresholds of the Kingdom, which shows people in slow motion arriving through customs and border control at London City Airport. And of course, the opening of John's Gospel famously is in your Angel, which you learnt backwards and then recite phonetically in reverse, so that the film, when played backwards, gives the impression that it's being spoken strangely, but intelligibly.
Yes. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
How have you chosen those texts, or do you feel that they found you in some way?
Yeah, I think they probably found me. I mean, in a sense, I suppose, in the sort of at some point in the about mid to late 90s, where I started more self-consciously making work about faith. I think those texts did find me. I think in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That whole opening to John's Gospel, just resonated really, and the word. What is that? Is that okay? So the Word made flesh, but I quote Beckett saying, "In the beginning was the Pun," and I suppose it was thinking about that and how these texts come down to us, and so I the convoluted kind of way that I came about making that work was for it to be a bit like a revelation, because in the process of watching it, you are deconstructing it to the point when you realise that I must have been making these, bizarre sounds that make no sense, and it's only refracted through this process that one reaches that.
All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the life of man.
And I suppose, in the beginning was the Word. Well, we are born into language, and we wouldn't be able to communicate in this interview if that weren't so, and there is no such thing as a private language, and so it's one's relationship to that as well. So, Joyce talks about the nightmare of history, and that's the idea that you're thrown into existence, but within a very strict parameters of the context of which country, which faith or no faith, which and all the rest of it, and the rest of your life you're kind of battling against that kind of contingency, and whereas faith kind of promises something that transcends that and has a meaning beyond all the usual day-to-day quotidian kind of struggles and in a sense, we all exist with our own ideal self that doesn't have to deal with a lot of the things that we have to deal with day to day, and I think it kind of speaks to that as well. That there's you're kind of aspiring to a better self. Yeah.
One of the British theologians I've been influenced by is a man called John Milbank, and he's published a book called The Word Made Strange. And in a way, that angel work precisely does make the word strange. And I think the strangeness that comes out in that work does more than one thing. It partly reflects on the fact that the word is strange to many people in our contemporary culture, that these are alien texts.
Yeah, yeah.
But also, and I think this is also true of Ecce Homo, your sculpture that initially was on the Fourth Plinth in Trafalgar Square in the Millennium Year, it also properly makes strange the word to people who feel over-familiar with it. So there's a sort of comfortableness that perhaps a lot of Christians have with what they think the Bible says or means, or what they think Jesus is like.
Yes.
And in both cases, I think you strangify it, you strangify the text, you make it strange again, and you make Jesus strange again in a way that is important. Because Christians, like anyone, can become quite idolatrously related to their own truths and their own traditions, so that they don't allow them to disturb them.
Yeah. You know, the Fourth Plinth, when I was first approached about that, I mean, it's sort of documented that I mean, I did have the notion for it by the end of the phone call, and I've never had anything kind of come to me quite that suddenly and completely, but also we were coming up to the millennium. Conservative and Labour governments had been a bit squeamish of celebrating Christ's birth, or we're 2,000 years since that, and you know, taking care in a multicultural, multi-faith society. One can understand that, but then what one couldn't understand was the Millennium Dome and government ministers going off to Disneyland and kind of, you know, what should we put in there, you know? And that we are, I suppose, accustomed to statuary in public civic spaces that actually, well, I mean, we begin to take a more cogent interest in it more recently, but actually it's just a kind of street furniture that, you know, you'd be hard pressed for anyone to name the two standing figures in Trafalgar Square, you know, in front of those two plinths for equestrian statues, you know, and to have something life-size there in amongst this oversized big black bronzes of
often military.
Yes, exactly.
Big civic figures.
Indeed.
Benefactors.
But
it really was a counterpoint to that.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's interesting that the only, in my recollection, the only other significant public acknowledgement of the millennium was the National Gallery's Seeing Salvation exhibition.
Yes.
So your work almost became like a threshold for that exhibition.
Yeah, that's true, actually. Yeah,
and that too, I think, faced quite a lot of controversy at the time. It proved itself, just as Ecce Homo did, that the public response to it was very largely positive.
Yes, it was.
Despite those people who were concerned it would offend.
Yeah.
But there was an interesting sort of, almost a symbiosis that emerged between your sculpture and that exhibition.
Yes, yeah. But there was still, you know, there was one moment that I remember I had an exhibition in Italy, and I got a ridiculously early flight to come back to do an interview with Neil McGregor in the square, talking both about the sculpture and the exhibition,
which he had curated.
Sorry, I should. Yeah. And you know, the TV, they were making a program, you know, based around that. The show, the BBC, and instead of carrying anything from that interview, they chose a clip of like a 14, 15-year-old girl outside an ice cream van being asked what she thought.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? And I think there was sort of like an embarrassment of carrying on with any kind of seriousness, you know, which kind of, I found happened quite a lot as a sort of almost knee-jerk reaction that we can't quite, Even the unveiling was carried live on the BBC, and the correspondent got me to the furthest point diagonally across the square, and filmed me so I had my back to the actual unveiling. And just as the unveiling was happening, he said, "What? So why Christ? Why not Posh Spice and David Beckham?" And I think there was a certain kind of fear of a serious religious sculpture.
Yeah. The reappearance of that sculpture in other locations, though, has enabled it to do some, I think, really wonderful things, different every time.
Yeah.
And its recent presence at the west end of St Paul's Cathedral, on the exterior, facing away from the cathedral, I thought had the very interesting effect of associating the cathedral with Roman imperial power, because that's where Christ is presented to the people at the Praetorium by Pontius Pilate.
Yeah.
And those huge pillars at the west end of St Paul's suddenly became Roman imperial pillars. And I thought for the cathedral to be brave enough to invite that comparison, I thought was quite, and by placing the sculpture where they did, I thought was quite bold on their part. They sort of have made themselves vulnerable to the judgment of the Christ.
No, I think you're right, and I think they kind of it was a recognition of the power they have, and that might need to be questioned, because it was in collaboration with Amnesty International that necessarily is people who are made extraordinarily vulnerable and well, obviously worse for speaking truth to power, or kind of,
I think it really worked.
I think because you could be on the same level as well. I mean, I think there were certain felicities, I hope, in the sculpture that weren't perhaps so apparent in the square when he's up on the plinth.
Because people could, it's life-size.
So you would have a one-to-one kind of, the fact that he had his eyes closed.
I've recently run a project, a series of symposia, where with a group of art historians and theologians, we've thought about different prepositions that connect the words art and Christianity in modern and contemporary art. And some of the ones we looked at were art for Christianity, so the ongoing practice of churches commissioning artists. Art against Christianity, of which one can think of some examples, either art that wants to replace it or forcefully critique it. Art about Christianity, which might just comment on it. And then art with Christianity that uses inherited religious iconography to say other things, to comment on the Bosnian War or whatever it is. And I wonder, I have an idea how you might answer this, but I wonder, when you think about your own body of work, whether there are any one of those prepositions particularly seems to fit what you've done with, for, about, or against.
That's a very good question. I mean, thinking about Ecce Homo, that I was aware that I was going to be making something that would, or how that would be perceived by believers and non-believers, and so that is the moment where Christ is facing up to his destiny, but at the same time, that is the moment that we are implicated as being in the crowd, in the mob, in the and so whether he is the Son of God or he is a religious or political leader or whatever, we are responsible for his fate, So, so I suppose I'm trying to be within and without, but you know, I have him with shorn of hair because that's what was happening to prisoners of war in Bosnia, which is the first time we've seen that since the Holocaust, really, you know, and so again, I wanted him to be contemporary and still chime with a kind of history of those of depictions of that moment. You know, there are a lot of paintings of Ecce Homo art historically, but very few sculptures, because I think it's so undemonstrative sculpture. A man just standing there with his hands bound, you know, and I mean, it sounds a bit like I'm trying to have my cake and eat it, but you know, I think I'm kind of I'm fascinated with things that seek to establish some kind of meaning or a deep kind of emotional resonance, you know.
I wonder with the audiences of your work, they struggle to even get some of the biblical references that you make. Has that been an obstacle for you? That actually things that you know or have found out are things that people have... There's a famous story of someone in the National Gallery or some famous gallery saying, you know, I love all these mothers and children, but why is the kid always a boy?
Yes.
That degree of biblical illiteracy.
Yes.
Might create problems even for your own work.
Well, perhaps so, you know, and I think, I mean, my sister tells a story of being in a jeweller's in Loughton in Essex, and the assistant showing someone who's got these crosses here and in gold and silver, and then we've got some here with a little man on, you know. And I mean, you know, this is kind of... so if you're up against that, but that really is an extreme example, maybe I should go there. But before we can move on, you know, we've got to think about how we got here, you know. And if we haven't got much curiosity about how we got here, then, the future could be quite bleak, perhaps. You know.
I know that you've talked about yourself as a Christian atheist.
Yeah.
And all atheists are some type of atheist.
Yes.
There isn't a generic atheist.
No.
But I remember talking quite recently to the German artist Andrea Büttner, and I asked her the question whether she thought of her art as what prepositions she would use.
Yeah.
And in relation to against, she said, I'm against, which is itself a kind of suspension.
Yeah, that's good.
And I feel as though that would be true of your work. That
yes,
it's too decided to be against.
It is, and I think it's if you didn't have, going back to what you were saying earlier about the word or the gospel, you know, in a form that everyone can read. Going back before that, you know, those stories and those moments are all the moments of joy and struggle and everything else that are the story of everyone's lives, you know, and those things have been thought about, you know, refracted through this particular faith, but those are still the most important things that we deal with. So it still is a vastly important story. And also it's the other thing about being steeped in those stories and the art is it's like, you know, we've had 2,000 years of variations on very particular themes, and we know the ones that are meaningful to us beyond the others within each kind of genre, you know, whether, you know, from the Annunciation to Christ on the cross, really, you know, but all those other, things that, you know, tell a more general story about how we lead our lives, and that's a very valuable thing as well, because that's you're looking for a truth that's an important truth to oneself, and by and certain artists that you trust to make those moments so palpably real and meaningful. Yeah.
Well, that great tradition, which has repeatedly been personalised by artists over the centuries and brought home to particular communities and contexts by them, is something that you continue to do. And there's something uniquely personalised about your relationship with all of this huge legacy. And you make it Mark Wallinger-ish. And that's a great gift, I think, to us, and a reminder that you stand in a long tradition, but are doing something really and wonderfully new with it for 21st century audiences. So thank you for that gift, and thank you very much for the opportunity to come and talk to you about your work.
Well, thank you, Ben. It's been a pleasure.